All right. Good evening, everybody. Let's get started now. Thank you very much for coming tonight. This is the 6th of our 7 lectures on the topic of justice. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw together at the end here a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about in the first 5 weeks. I want to begin in an unusual place for this lecture series, and that is with something contemporary. When we talk about the idea of justice, our mind goes immediately to all kinds of things that are going on in the world with our courts, with our laws, with the Justice Department. And we have a fascinating case going on that is in the headlines almost daily right now, involving Jeffrey Epstein. And if you haven't seen the video from World Without Exploitation, it's a 1-minute video featuring some of the victims of Jeffrey Epstein going back 30 years. And it's really powerful. And I had made the mistake of not paying too much attention to the Epstein scandal, thinking this is another political scandal. I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I don't think it is just a political scandal. I think it's something. What happens when we pay attention to the victims themselves, what we find is a real appeal to the heart, and the appeal is the appeal of suffering. And what I want to say is that this goes to the heart of what justice is. Justice is the way in which our society tries to address suffering that comes from the abuse of power. Now, when we go back and look historically at where the idea of justice comes from, what we find is something really fascinating, that for probably most of the world's history, the majority of societies didn't have any way to address this problem of human suffering. Human suffering was taken to be an inescapable condition, and there was a lot of emphasis in all the literature we have from all over the world on being fortunate to avoid the suffering which is inescapable for just about everybody. Slavery was pervasive all over the world at different times in just about every civilization. It was certainly pervasive in any agrarian kind of civilization, because slavery is the means by which they kept their economies going. But another important function of slavery in every place where it existed was sexual exploitation. Now, why didn't ancient cultures resist slavery? And we think, well, of course, there must have been a resistance to that. Why wasn't there a resistance to the idea of harming those who are most vulnerable? The emphasis over and again seemed to be, you want to make sure that you don't become one of those most vulnerable. The only literature we have which kind of addresses head on this issue of whether somebody in power should voluntarily give up power for the sake of justice, for the sake of doing what's right, which is something that we think is kind of foundational to society. The earliest literature, the only thing in the ancient world addressing this, comes from Thucydides, who was really the world's first historian. He wrote a book called The History of the Peloponnesian War. And in that book, there's a short chapter of it that is called the Melian Dialogue. It's become a really famous passage now. It concerns the Athenian attempt to invade and conquer the island of Melos, which was in the Mediterranean, and the Athenians at the time were at war with Sparta and regarded it as a suitable area to locate a port. And the Malians, when the Athenians approached them with their ships, the first thing they did is they sent a delegation to the Malians to ask them to surrender, because they had overwhelming force and they could save the trouble of a battle. The Malians tried to plead with them not to invade their country. They said, we've been a neutral party for 700 years. We have no part in the war that you have going on with Sparta. So respect justice and don't take over our country. And the dialogue is fascinating because they have all kinds of arguments for why the Athenians should not invade, why it would be wrong. The Athenians refute the arguments one by one. And you read the dialogue hoping that the Malians can be persuasive, but realizing in most ways the Athenians are just right. And what they say at the end is, you don't understand. It's a law of human nature that the strong do what they like, and the weak must accept it. So they invade the island, they conquer the city, they kill all of the adult males, and they take the women and children as slaves. And this was the common practice. Throughout the ancient world, in all kinds of literature, what we find is even when there is objections to slavery, it's an objection about how slave masters are treating their slaves, not an objection to the institution itself. And there is widespread what we would call sex trafficking as part of the institution of slavery. But more than that, there's not just sex trafficking with slavery, there's also sex trafficking of the poor and of children. And it's just pervasive. Throughout the Greek and Roman world, you find it everywhere. In Athens, wealthy parents would hire a bodyguard to protect their children, especially their young boys, from sexual predators. Pederasty was such a common practice. It was frowned upon, but not illegal. Right? This just strikes us as odd. So how do we come to be outraged at what Jeffrey Epstein did and at what the people who allowed him to continue to get away with what he did? How do we come to be outraged by that? That's an interesting historical question. The first evidence we have of any kind of systematic objection to the practice of slavery comes through the influence of Augustine. And we talked about Augustine a few weeks ago on his idea of love as something that all human beings deserve, as being created in God's image. And since God loved us, we have a duty of love to everybody else, and kind of instantiating that into what was at the time kind of a newly developing Christian theology. It was shortly after that Gregory of Nyssa, who's also like Augustine, a 4th century bishop, he puts into a sermon and a series of sermons, but we have this one sermon where he says, you are condemning to slavery human beings whose nature is free and characterized by free will. You are making laws that rival the law of God, overturning the law appropriate to humankind. This is a new idea in the history of the world, the idea that there can be a higher law that undergirds civil law, because civil law is instantiated by those who are in power. And that has been regarded throughout the world as the highest law. Now, what's coming into the world is this new idea that there could be a higher law that would make civil law unjust. And then the first time we have this expressed in law comes from the Theodosian Code that states pimps, fathers, and slave owners who force their daughters or slave women into prostitution will not only lose that power which they held, but they will be proscribed by exile to the public minds. This is the first time we see something like this instantiated into law. So it's important to realize that it's not inevitable that we be outraged by something that Jeffrey Epstein did. For most of human history, that is not an outrageous occurrence. There's a historical story, and there are ideas that underlie it. Because of the political turmoil of the Middle Ages, that instantiation of the idea of a higher law does not get instantiated widespread into any national codes, because there are fiefdoms that are at war with one another. That we find it expressed here and there for a short period of time, but it never gets established as a basic practice, or certainly as a social norm, until the 18th century. Then we get thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Immanuel Kant. We get these thinkers that are developing for the first time, like the philosophical foundations of a theory of inalienable human rights. And so they put this idea of everybody being radically equal and deserving of love. They put it into the language of rights. And we find it appearing in all kinds of places then in the 18th century. We find it, for example, in our Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution. But we find even in this country, we find still at war with one another, like these ideas of a pre-existing higher law that should undergird any civil law and what alone can make it legitimate, with older ideas of the necessity and acceptability of slavery and other forms of cruelty or oppression of the powerful over the weak. And you get that continuing right up until the present day. Like we have at the present time, the best estimates are about 50 million slaves in the world today. These are what modern slavery that would include sex trafficking, but also all kinds of forms of forced labor. The reported victims of sex trafficking, the last year we have a really good count in the United States, 17,000 victims. There's an estimated about 1,000 victims of Jeffrey Epstein, but then he did that for about 30 years and had an extensive network. We have about 2023 reported 17,000 victims. Those are only the reported cases. It's probably the tip of the iceberg because most cases don't get reported. So this is a widespread problem. So to think that the institution of slavery is something that we have bypassed somehow is simply not true. And it is a scandal to my mind, not just that somebody like Jeffrey Epstein got away for so long with what he did, and that the powerful people who enabled him continue to be unpunished for what they did. It's a scandal that we continue to allow this all over the world. So I want to turn this to a more contemporary thinker who I think did this amazing job of explaining why we battle so much with the idea of justice. And her name is Simone Weil. Simone Weil was born in 1909. She died in, I think it was 1948. I put the dates on your sheet there. She was born to a Jewish family in France. She was early in her professional career. She was a school teacher in France. She ran off to join the Spanish Civil War. She also taught for a while in the factories because she was so indignant and concerned about the plight of workers in many of these factories in the early 20th century, thinking that this was a kind of forced labor, a kind of slavery that nobody was paying attention to. She worked in a factory for a while until she collapsed due to her health. When the Nazis began to invade France, her family escaped to the United States, but she did everything she could to return. She wanted to return and help the cause of freedom, and she was finally able to get a passage on a ship back to England, where the Charles de Gaulle government in exile had located in London, and she volunteered for them, and she wrote a fascinating draft of a book called The Need for Roots. It was kind of a philosophical foundation of what she envisioned would be the new government once the Nazis were defeated, the new French government. But she ended up dying in London of tuberculosis. So here we have somebody who died fairly young, who never left behind any really completed, polished works, but she left behind all kinds of notebooks and essays that are really profound. And what she does in these notebooks and these journals and these essays is she keeps going back to the ancient ideas of truth, beauty, justice, love, and the soul, the very ideas that we've been talking about, as kind of foundational ideas. And she thought they were all connected and they all come to fruition in our idea of justice, in a proper understanding of what justice is. And fundamental to her vision is that we misunderstand justice if we think it's mostly about the laws, if we think it's mostly about rights and obligations, what she called the pettiness of claims and counterclaims. It's not that claims and counterclaims don't matter, but when somebody is suffering, and they're undergoing what she calls affliction, and this is not mild suffering. This is the kind of suffering when you feel like your soul is being annihilated. This affliction where you feel like your personhood is being destroyed. And she says, there is always a cry when that happens. And the hardest thing to do is to listen to them. Why is it so hard to listen to them? It is so hard to listen to them because we have to really imagine what it is like to be in their condition. And this is unimaginable to us. Our mind just retreats from the idea that that kind of suffering could happen to ourselves. And she says, whatever it happens, it's a sign of grace whenever this happens. And it's an expression of love. Now, how do we get into this condition? This is the great challenge. She says, well, one thing we can do is we can try to create a society in which we have three things established to help us. One is a system of education that teaches us the vocabulary of expressing our deepest needs. Not just our wants and our desires, not our sensations, but our deepest needs. And we have to have that vocabulary both to express when those deepest needs are being destroyed in us, when they're being taken from us, and to be able to hear it when other people are claiming that that's happening to them. This is the language of the soul. And she says, we don't do a good job of teaching people the language of the soul. We exist in a language of superficialities that don't get to human depth. The second is we need to develop a culture of attentive silence so that we can hear the cries of the suffering. Because the thing about the cries of the suffering is they're often silent. And this is the case, by the way, of Epstein's victims. The headlines are full of stories about the scandal. It's full of stories about which party has got dirt on the other party, about the machinations to try to get the files released, about who gets to see them and everything else. But we don't hear much directly from the victims themselves. And why is that? We have to develop the capacity for the kind of attentive silence that wants to hear. And why do suddenly then, at some point, these victims of Jeffrey Epstein, a few of them rise to the level of attention? But there are thousands of other victims of sex trafficking in this country that never do, that we never hear. And she says it's not only that we don't want to listen, it's that this culture of attentive silence has to be the kind of attentive silence that is patient enough to be in the presence of suffering. And so this is really important. This is part of developing certain kinds of social norms. This is really demanding for a society to do. And then the third thing is we have to have institutions that puts power into the hands of people willing to listen to the cry of those who are suffering. We have to have institutions that put people into positions of power that care about justice. Right? So those are like a system of education that teaches us a vocabulary, a culture of attentive silence so we hear the cry of suffering, and then putting people in power who care about justice. So those are the three things that if we really care about justice as going to the heart of, that is, justice as an understanding of people, not justice as a place for competing claims, right? And in her dissatisfaction with the idea that a system of justice can mainly be an arena for competing claims is that the people who are suffering most never get into that arena. That is the problem. And that's what justice should be most concerned about. So I'm going to wrap up here. Justice, truth, beauty, and love. These are her concerns. Justice, Simone Weil believes, is the instantiation of goodness in the world. It comes about when we listen for the truth. And we can only listen to the truth when we are attentive. It is impossible to be genuinely attentive to suffering when we are enslaved to our desires. How do we learn not to be enslaved to our desires? Beauty teaches us that. Because beauty doesn't satisfy our desires. It only satisfies it when we're content with watching it, but not trying to possess it. So beauty, this is one of the things that Emerson taught, like beauty cannot be possessed. It can be seen, and then we can learn to appreciate it. It says, this is the first step in learning to be satisfied by something quite deep that does not respond to our desires. When we learn that, then we can become attentive in the proper way. And we will actually see the beauty in people, even in the midst of suffering. Because we won't be so turned away from their suffering because of our discomfort in ourselves, we will be seeing them as people. This is her claim. So it can transform our desires. So this is, I'm hoping that we are able to see how some of these ideas fit together. As I explained to you, like in the very first lecture, doing this lecture series is partly to get me motivated to work on the outline for a book, so that like I'm still working this out. I'm trying to see I've got some idea of the connection of these ideas, but I'm still trying to work it out as I talk, and I appreciate you being patient. The next lecture then is on nature, and this is where